The public severing was intended to shatter her spirit. The pack altar of Silverglade sat at the very heart of the territory, a massive, jagged slab of ancient obsidian that seemed to swallow the ambient light of the surrounding torches. It was a structure built specifically to humble the weak and elevate the strong. This night, the atmosphere was brittle with a deep, punishing frost, the kind of absolute winter chill that cracked thick tree branches and froze breath before it could fully leave the lungs. Hundreds of pack members had gathered in a wide, suffocating circle around the stone. They held thick pine pitch torches, the flames spitting and hissing angrily against the violently falling snow, casting long, monstrous shadows across the trampled, muddy ground. The heavy scent of burning pitch, wet animal fur, and a palpable, metallic anticipation hung thick in the frozen air. In the absolute center of this predatory ring stood Seren Vantrell. She did not shiver. The threadbare grey wool of her cloak was woefully inadequate against the sub-zero draft, yet the agonizing cold biting into her pale skin was nothing compared to the violent, chaotic storm raging inside her chest. Her inner wolf was frantic, reduced to a cornered, terrified thing. The beast paced relentlessly against the rigid cage of her ribs, letting out a high, desperate, vibrating whine that echoed only in the hollow chambers of her skull. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her sternum, a desperate biological drumbeat anticipating execution. Her pupils were blown wide, tracking the subtle, aggressive shifts in the posture of the warriors surrounding her. Opposite her stood Alpha Thomas Sterling. He was wrapped tightly in magnificent, heavy black pelts, his broad shoulders squared, his chin tipped upward in an expression of absolute, unyielding arrogance. The firelight danced in his pale, calculating eyes, highlighting the sharp, cruel lines of a face that had once promised her lifelong safety. At this moment, that face was a drawn weapon. He shifted his weight, his heavy leather boots crunching loudly against the frozen mud, commanding the attention of the clearing. He wanted this to be a public spectacle. He had specifically summoned the revered elders, the elite frontline warriors, and the lowest kitchen servants to watch the precise moment he discarded his fated mate for being too quiet, too unremarkable, too painfully low status. He fully expected her to collapse onto the ground. He anticipated the tears, the hysterical begging, the desperate crawling in the mud that would publicly validate his supreme, undisputed authority. The surrounding crowd leaned forward, a collective holding of breath. Jackson Vance, a duty-bound beta standing near the front of the inner circle, shifted his weight uncomfortably, a visible unease settling over his usually stoic features as he watched the scene unfold. The community had always ignored the young woman, treating the quiet Omega as a mere background fixture meant for scrubbing floors and mending torn tunics. But in this singular moment, her absolute stillness felt vastly heavier than any Alpha's shouted command. The tension in the clearing stretched until it threatened to snap the ancient pines. Thomas raised one heavily gloved hand. The low, aggressive murmuring of the assembly vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating, heavy quiet. Even the howling mountain wind seemed to temporarily die down, leaving only the sharp crackle of the burning torches. "I stand before the ancestors," the Alpha's voice boomed, a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated aggressively through the frozen earth beneath Seren's worn boots. To correct a tragic mistake of blind fate, he did not look at her with even a fraction of regret. There was only cold, strategic, political dismissal in his gaze. Seren kept her own storm grey eyes fixed firmly on the exposed hollow of his throat, refusing to meet his stare, refusing to grant him the deep satisfaction of witnessing her terror. Her hands, hidden entirely beneath the dark folds of her cloak, were curled into fists so tight that her unmanicured nails bit deep crescent moons into her palms. These were hands heavily scarred from years of unseen, unappreciated labor, scrubbing the keep's stone floors until her knuckles bled, tending the bitter winter gardens, and silently binding the combat wounds of the very warriors who now stood eagerly watching her public ruin. "I, Thomas," he continued, the words sharp, practiced, and highly deliberate, "hereby sever this sacred tie. I reject you, Seren, as my fated mate and permanently cast you out from the protection of my bloodline." The biological backlash was instantaneous, visceral. The tearing of a fated bond was not a metaphor. It was an amputation of the soul. It began as a crushing, burning pressure at the base of the outcast's skull, a white-hot agony that surged violently down her spine like poured liquid iron. The golden, pulsing thread that had connected her subconscious to his suddenly stretched to its absolute physiological limit, vibrating with a horrific, screeching frequency. Then it snapped. Seren's vision whited out completely. A concussive wave of invisible force slammed directly into her chest, driving every ounce of oxygen from her lungs in a silent, agonizing gasp. Her internal beast collapsed backward, letting out a final, soundless howl of pure, unadulterated agony before curling into a tight, dormant ball in the darkest, coldest corner of her mind. The familiar scent of him, the comforting aroma of wood smoke and bitter cedar that had once reliably anchored her entire existence, turned instantly to the nauseating smell of rotting ash and burnt copper. The temperature of her skin plummeted drastically, her blood running sluggish and freezing within her veins. She swayed dangerously, her knees trembling violently under the immense crushing gravity of the newly severed connection. The crowd pressed closer, their eyes wide and hungry. They waited for the inevitable scream. They waited for the weeping. Seren deliberately closed her eyes, swallowed the harsh copper taste of fresh blood from where she had bitten her own inner cheek, and forced her spine perfectly, rigidly straight. When she opened her eyes a second later, the storm-grey depths were completely clear, hardened like winter ice, and entirely devoid of a single tear. She did not beg, she did not plead, she did not utter a single pathetic word of defense. Gradually, with absolute terrifying calm, she withdrew her left hand from beneath the safety of her cloak. Her fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against the freezing metal on her ring finger, the silver pack ring. It was a heavy, crude band of iron and silver that marked her perpetual servitude and her permanently low status, a chain she had obediently worn since adolescence. The object had practically frozen to her skin in the sub-zero mountain air. She gripped the metal tightly and twisted it sharply upward. The sheer friction tore a thin layer of skin directly from her knuckle, a bright, startling bead of red blood welling to the surface, but she did not so much as flinch. She pulled it free. The sudden, absolute absence of its suffocating weight felt like a strange, terrifying liberation. Seren stepped forward. Her worn boots made absolutely no sound on the icy ground. She closed the short distance to the dark obsidian altar, moving with a haunting, ghost-like grace that deeply unsettled the watchers. The man watched her approach, his jaw tightening aggressively, his pupils contracting in sudden, tense, and furious confusion. This was explicitly not the script he had envisioned. She was supposed to shatter. She reached out and placed the heavy band onto the frozen stone. It made a sharp, resonant clink that echoed across the silent clearing like a striking executioner's bell. She did not look at the ring. She did not look at the Alpha, who had just hollowed out her soul and left her to rot. Without a single backward glance, the young woman turned her back on the warmth of the roaring torches. She pulled the hood of her thin cloak tightly over her head, shielding her face from the biting wind, and began to walk. The dense crowd of wolves parted instinctively, stepping back nervously, as if she were suddenly made of volatile magic and sharp edges. She moved steadily through the sea of heavily armed bodies, leaving the only home she had ever known, stepping directly into the path of a lethal winter storm. She walked away with flawless, untouchable dignity, leaving the local ruler standing silently in the absolute center of his own, unnerved, profoundly disturbed territory. The heavy tree line swallowed her whole, plunging her into an immediate, suffocating darkness. The exact moment Seren crossed the invisible, magical boundary of the pack's territory, the subtle ambient warmth that constantly protected the inhabited lands vanished without a trace, replaced by the sheer, brutal reality of the unprotected northern wilderness. A massive winter blizzard was rolling aggressively down from the towering, jagged peaks of the Frost Peak mountain range, carrying violent winds that howled through the canyons like starving, desperate beasts. Every single step forward was a brutal physical battle against gravity and the rapidly deepening snowdrifts. The threadbare cloak offered zero actual insulation. It was soaked entirely through within the first grueling mile, clinging to her freezing skin like a suffocating sheet of solid ice. Her scarred hands, now completely bare and fully exposed to the elements, turned a mottled, painful purple, then faded to a waxy, terrifying white. The furious wind lashed relentlessly at her face, carrying tiny, razor-sharp crystals of ice that sliced cleanly across her pale cheeks, drawing thin, microscopic lines of blood that froze instantly upon her skin. The silence inside her head was deafening, a vast and terrifying emptiness. For her entire life, her inner wolf had been a constant, reassuring companion, a reliable source of deep instinct, internal warmth, and subtle, comforting vibration. Now, the spiritual beast lay completely catatonic, crushed entirely by the severe trauma of the public rejection. The severed connection point at the base of her neck throbbed continuously with a hollow, freezing ache. It felt exactly as though a vital, beating organ had been surgically removed without a drop of anesthesia, leaving a gaping, invisible wound that bled freezing energy out into the unforgiving night. She forced one trembling foot in front of the other. The heavy snow was now packed tightly up to her knees, dragging at her worn boots like heavy iron chains meant to pull her into the earth. Her breathing became incredibly shallow and jagged, each desperate inhalation burning the delicate tissue of her lungs as the sub-zero air crystallized deep in her throat. She had no specific destination in mind. She only knew with absolute, primal certainty that she had to put as much physical distance between herself and the obsidian altar as her failing body would allow. She would absolutely not let them find her frozen corpse resting on their borders. She would never give them the ultimate satisfaction of witnessing her final ruin. The world steadily narrowed down to the very next agonizing step, and then the next. The relentless, shrieking howling of the wind completely drowned out the pathetic sound of her own ragged breathing. The dense, swirling whiteout erased the pale moon, the distant stars, and the towering ancient pines, leaving her trapped entirely in an endless, freezing sensory void. Lesser beings were merely prey in a landscape of predators. The sheer scale of the mountain storm made her deeply aware of her own extreme physical fragility. She was nothing but a fragile, broken outcast marching stubbornly into a landscape designed to kill seasoned frontline warriors. Inevitably, the physiological breakdown accelerated. The violent, uncontrollable shivering that had racked her slender frame for the first brutal hour suddenly stopped. A dangerous, highly deceptive lethargy began to seep deeply into her exhausted muscles. Her heavy, unresponsive limbs suddenly felt strangely weightless, as if she were walking on clouds rather than packed ice. The agonizing, sharp pain in her hands and feet faded entirely into a dull, distant, and peaceful numbness. She possessed enough basic healing knowledge to know exactly what this physiological shift meant. Her body was actively shutting down, pulling all remaining warm blood flow aggressively away from her dying extremities to desperately protect her failing core organs. The inevitable end was rapidly approaching. She finally reached the true northern border, a desolate area marked by a massive ancient ridge of jagged black iron stone. Her numb foot caught hard on a hidden, frozen root buried deep beneath the thick snowpack. She possessed absolutely no physical strength left to correct her shifting balance. She fell forward into the dark. The harsh impact was surprisingly muffled by the deep, powdery snowbank that had gathered against the stone ridge. She instinctively tried to push herself back up, her waxy, frozen fingers digging uselessly into the hard ice, but her trembling arms simply refused to support her negligible weight. She collapsed heavily onto her side, her bruised cheek coming to rest gently against the freezing, crystalline surface of the snow. The profound cold seeped directly into her bones, rapidly slowing the frantic, irregular beating of her heart to a quiet, rhythmic crawl. It was almost strangely peaceful, this encompassing, quiet numbness. The agonizing, fiery pain of the broken mate bond finally began to fade, swallowed entirely by the overwhelming absolute freeze of the ancient mountain. Her eyelashes, heavy with accumulated frost, fluttered as her eyelids grew incredibly heavy. As the dark, silent void finally pulled her under, her last conscious thought was a quiet, stoic surrender to the endless winter. She was completely unaware of the massive, terrifying royal presence that had just locked onto her fading scent from the high peaks above. Lycan King Seren Valerius had spent a century searching for the one soul meant to calm his feral beast. Now, feeling the jagged, violent spike of her failing life force through the ancient earth, he was already tearing through the blizzard, his heavy cedar fur cloak snapping in the wind, descending with desperate, thunderous speed to claim the mate that the lesser wolves had so foolishly discarded. The impact of the Lycan King's arrival shook the very bedrock of the ancient mountain. Seren Valerius did not merely walk through the blizzard, he shattered it. A massive, concussive wave of dominant, molten energy radiated outward from his towering frame, forcing the howling winds to physically break and scatter around him. For 100 years, the supreme ruler of all shifters had endured an agonizing, hollow existence, a cursed century of absolute isolation, where his feral beast violently rejected every elite female presented to the royal court. He had spent decades preparing to die alone, convinced that love was something he could never afford. But tonight, a violent, jagged tear in the magical fabric of the continent had slammed into his chest, carrying the distinct fading scent of wild snowdrops, crushed pine, and copper blood. He found her half buried against the jagged black ironstone ridge. The terrifying monarch, a warlord who had brought entire rival empires to their knees, without blinking, immediately dropped to his knees in the freezing mud. The heavy, packed snow crunched loudly beneath his massive weight as he crawled the final 2 feet toward her motionless body. His breathing was jagged, ragged, and entirely devoid of its usual terrifying control. His turbulent irises, usually as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea, were rapidly bleeding into a vibrant, molten gold as his inner beast clawed frantically at the confines of his ribs. The majestic wolf whimpered, a deep chest-rattling sound of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed over the howling wind. Seren Vantrell looked entirely like a corpse. Her pale, scarred face was perfectly still, her lips tinted a dangerous, waxy blue that spoke of failing circulation. The threadbare grey wool of her pathetic soaked cloak was frozen solid, acting as a literal coffin of ice around her incredibly fragile frame. The nauseating, metallic stench of a forcefully severed mate bond clung heavily to her skin, a rotting aura of burnt ash that made Theron's upper lip curl back to expose elongated, lethal fangs in a flash of murderous fury. Thomas Sterling had dared to claim her. The arrogant Alpha had dared to break her. The realization sent a violent tremor of pure, world-ending rage down his spine, but he instantly forced the destructive emotion down. She could not survive his fury right now. She barely had enough life force to survive the next 3 minutes. With agonizing, painstaking slowness, Theron reached out. His massive hands, weapons capable of crushing solid steel, trembled violently as they hovered over her frozen form. He was terrified of breaking her further. When his burning, calloused fingertips finally brushed against the icy skin of her bruised cheek, the physical reaction was instantaneous and explosive. A violent rush of liquid heat detonated at the exact point of contact, the golden, pulsing thread of a true, ancient, fated bond. The kind of sacred magic that the lesser packs believed to be merely a myth snapped violently into place, anchoring his ancient soul directly to her fading one. The sheer intensity of the physiological connection made Seren gasp, a harsh, tearing sound in the empty wilderness. The agonizing, hollow ache that had plagued his chest for a century vanished instantly, replaced by a fierce, roaring hearth fire. But the immediate backlash was horrifying. Through the newly forged tether, he felt the exact, catastrophic state of her biological decline. He felt the sluggish, dying rhythm of her heart. He felt the terrifying, hollow void where her own inner wolf lay completely catatonic, crushed into a dormant ball of agony. She was slipping away. She was vanishing like smoke through a crack in the world. "No," the king rumbled. The single syllable vibrated with absolute supreme authority, a command issued not to the wolves, but to death itself. "I reject this ending. You do not get to leave me." Without wasting another second, Seren tore the heavy cedar fur cloak from his broad shoulders. The magnificent garment, woven from the thickest, warmest pelts of the northern predators, was deeply infused with his own personal scent, a rich, overwhelming aroma of dark cedar, ancient pine, and molten gold. He moved with supernatural speed, his massive hands working with impossible gentleness as he cracked the frozen shell of her grey cloak and wrapped her entirely in his royal furs. The heavy garment swallowed her slight frame completely, immediately trapping his intense, radiating body heat against her freezing skin. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her against his broad, muscular chest as if she weighed absolutely nothing. The contrast between them was stark and heartbreaking. He was a mountain of raw, untamed power and lethal heat, wrapped in dark leather and iron. She was a fragile, broken bird, discarded by lesser men who possessed no concept of her actual worth. Seren tucked her frozen face into the crook of his warm neck, deliberately pressing her ear directly over his own hammering heart, instinctively using the powerful, steady rhythm of his Lycan biology to coax her failing pulse back into a regular cadence. His beast paced frantically just beneath his skin, whining, demanding to bite, demanding to mark her and force his healing venom into her veins. But Seren aggressively locked the primal urge away. He would not claim her in a state of unconscious vulnerability. He would not act like the arrogant, pathetic alpha who had just thrown her away. He would earn her. The blizzard shrieked in protest as Seren stood tall, wrapping his muscular arms securely around the bundle of fur. He turned his back on the jagged ironstone ridge, his golden eyes locking onto the towering, distant peaks where Frost Peak Keep awaited. He did not walk back up the mountain. He surged upward, moving with a terrifying, predatory speed, his powerful legs eating up the treacherous, icy terrain, as if the deadly winter storm were nothing but a gentle summer breeze. He poured every ounce of his massive, supernatural aura outward, creating a literal sphere of localized heat that actively melted the falling snowflakes before they could even touch the heavy cedar fur cloak protecting his queen. The journey up the sheer cliff faces of the royal territory was a blur of violent physical exertion and absolute, single-minded focus. Seren's powerful chest heaved, his breaths escaping in thick white plumes of steam that immediately evaporated in the freezing air. With every leap, with every brutal exertion of his immense strength, he kept his dominant focus locked entirely on the fragile life force, pulsing faintly against his collarbone. He constantly monitored the minute physiological changes in her body. He felt the exact moment the violent, uncontrollable shivering finally returned to her limbs, a paradoxical but highly positive medical sign that her nervous system was actively booting back up. Pulling his external heat deeply into her failing core, her tiny, scarred hands, still waxy and painfully cold, twitched weakly inside the folds of the heavy fur. One rough, calloused finger accidentally brushed against the exposed skin of his throat. The micro-gesture sent a violent electric shockwave of pure fire directly down Theron's spine. His jaw clenched so hard that the bone audibly cracked, his pupils expanding until his eyes were entirely black. The physical hunger to press his lips against that hand, to trace the brutal scars of her unappreciated labor with absolute reverence, was practically overwhelming. Instead, he simply tightened his protective grip, holding her closer, shielding her entirely from the hostile world that had dared to mock her. "Hold on," he chanted in a low, vibrating whisper, his lips brushing against the frosted crown of her dark hair. "Just a little longer, my quiet one. I have you. You will never know the cold again." The transition from the lethal, shrieking void of the northern blizzard to the absolute sanctuary of the Royal Mountain Keep was disorienting, profound, and overwhelmingly warm. Seren did not wake up all at once. Consciousness returned to her in agonizingly slow, fragmented sensory waves. The first thing her recovering brain registered was the temperature. She was no longer freezing. In fact, she was immersed in a cocoon of such intense, pervasive, and luxurious warmth that it made her severely damaged nerve endings tingle with a painful, waking static. The suffocating, heavy ice that had locked her joints was entirely gone, replaced by a pliant, soothing heat that seemed to seep directly into her marrow. The second sensation was the scent, the nauseating, metallic stench of her severed mate bond. The rotting ash that had nearly choked her to death at the Silverglade Pack altar was completely overpowered by a thick, intoxicating aroma. It was a rich, heavy blend of dark cedar, sharp mountain pine, and something deeply elemental, like the smell of a roaring hearth fire burning over molten gold. It was a scent that instantly bypassed her analytical human mind and spoke directly to her catatonic inner wolf. Deep within the darkest, most bruised corner of her subconscious, the spiritual beast slowly uncurled its tightly wound body, letting out a soft, highly confused, and questioning whimper. The quiet woman forced her heavy eyelids open. The physical effort felt equivalent to lifting massive boulders. Her storm-grey eyes, still slightly glassy from the severe hypothermia, slowly focused on her new surroundings. She was lying in the center of a massive, circular bed, completely engulfed in layers of thick, dry, velvet blankets and soft furs. The chamber around her was breathtaking, illuminated by the gentle golden light of a massive, roaring fireplace carved directly into the ancient mountain stone. The walls were draped in heavy, rich tapestries of silver and grey, designed to keep the brutal winter drafts at bay. The sheer, overwhelming luxury of the space was entirely alien to her. The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten, and the servants' quarters were where you went to be ignored. But this room was built for absolute, undeniable reverence. She instinctively tried to sit up, a sudden spike of survival panic flooding her veins. She was an outcast, an omega, a discarded, worthless thing. She had absolutely no right to be touching these pristine, expensive linens. Thomas was going to punish her. Jackson Vance was going to drag her by her hair back into the snow for daring to dirty a royal bed. "Please do not move, my lady." The voice was incredibly gentle, completely lacking the harsh, aggressive bark of a typical alpha command. Seren flinched violently anyway, her rigid spine snapping straight, her scarred hands immediately pulling the thick velvet blanket up to her chin in a defensive, stoic posture. She refused to cower, but her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Standing near the edge of the golden firelight was a tall, meticulously dressed man in the crisp, silver-trimmed robes of the royal medical caste. Elian Thorne, the head royal healer of Frost Peak Keep, did not step any closer. He deliberately kept his hands entirely visible, holding a small ceramic bowl of steaming, fragrant salve. His posture was completely relaxed, non-threatening, and deeply respectful. He was looking at her not as a nuisance, not as a broken stray, but with the profound, hushed awe one might reserve for a living deity. "Your core temperature plummeted to a highly critical level," the doctor explained in a soft, soothing cadence. his eyes carefully tracking her blown pupils to assess her neurological state. Your tissues suffered severe cellular trauma from the cold, and your spiritual center. It has sustained a catastrophic, violent shock. The severing of a fated bond is lethal in 90% of recorded cases. The fact that you are currently breathing is nothing short of a biological miracle. She stared at him, her throat impossibly dry. She swallowed hard, tasting the lingering copper of her own blood, but she did not speak. She had learned long ago that silence was her only reliable shield. Words could be twisted, mocked, and used as weapons. Silence was impenetrable. Elian seemed to completely understand her silent boundary. He slowly lowered his head in a deep, formal bow, a gesture of respect that practically gave Seren physiological whiplash. No one, absolutely no one, had ever bowed to her. I have applied a localized, heated poultice to your hands and feet to reverse the frost damage, the man continued, his voice maintaining its steady, calming rhythm. I noted the extensive, historical scarring on your palms and knuckles. It indicates years of severe, repetitive, physical labor without proper medical care. I have taken the liberty of treating those deep micro-fissures as well. They will no longer cause you pain when you close your fists. She looked down at her hands. They were resting gently on top of the velvet blanket, completely coated in a shimmering, warm, translucent salve that smelled strongly of crushed mint and healing earth. For the first time in 10 years, her joints did not ache with the deep, punishing stiffness of scrubbing freezing stone floors. The realization was so profound, so violently unexpected, that it threatened to break her ironclad composure. She immediately clamped down on her emotions, her jaw tightening, as she refused to let a single tear form in her eyes. Before she could process the healer's unprecedented kindness, the heavy, reinforced oak doors of the chamber opened. The air pressure in the golden-lit room instantly changed. It became impossibly heavy, thick with a terrifying, supreme predatory dominance that made every instinctual defense mechanism in the young woman's body scream in absolute terror. Lycan King Theron Valerius stepped into the room. He was no longer wearing his heavy winter furs. He was clad simply in dark, loose-fitting leather trousers and a crisp, unbuttoned white linen shirt that highlighted the terrifying, scarred expanse of his heavily muscled chest. Without the massive cloak, his sheer physical size was even more intimidating. He was beautiful, but beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. Sharp, lethal, and fundamentally designed for violence. But as he crossed the threshold, the Sovereign immediately stopped. He did not approach the bed. He did not march over to assert his absolute dominance over the space. Instead, the most feared monarch on the entire continent froze exactly 10 paces away, his massive shoulders locking into place. Seren watched, completely mesmerized by the intense, visible physical restraint warring across his sharp features. His massive hands were clenched into tight, agonizing fists at his sides, his knuckles completely white. His broad chest was heaving with harsh, shallow breaths, as if he were actively fighting a violent internal battle just to remain standing in place. His piercing gaze, swirling with dangerous, molten gold flakes, was locked onto her pale face with an intensity that practically burned the oxygen out of the room. The hunger, the raw, ancient, instinctual desperation radiating from him was utterly staggering. Yet he absolutely refused to take another step. He was deliberately anchoring himself to the floorboards to avoid overwhelming her deeply traumatized nervous system. "Elian," the king rumbled. His voice was a deep, chest-vibrating baritone that made the fine glass vials on the medical cart rattle softly. It held no anger, only an agonizing, tight restraint. "Report." "Her vital signs are steadily stabilizing, my king," the doctor replied, stepping smoothly backward, lowering his head submissively. "The profound hypothermia has been entirely reversed. However, the spiritual trauma of the severed bond is incredibly raw. Her beast is dormant. Her nervous system is completely flooded with cortisol. She requires absolute silence, extensive rest, and zero physical pressure. Understood, Seren gritted out, his jaw flexing so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. Leave us. The meticulous healer offered one final, respectful bow to the patient, collected his empty ceramic bowl, and silently slipped out of the heavy oak doors, pulling them firmly shut behind him. The heavy click of the iron latch echoed loudly in the quiet chamber. They were entirely alone. The Omega's internal beast whined softly, pressing itself flat against the metaphorical floor of her mind, highly unsure if this massive, terrifying predator was a threat or a savior. The intense, comforting scent of cedar and pine was radiating directly from him, confirming that he was the source of the heavy furs that had saved her life in the snow. She braced herself. She knew exactly how powerful men operated. They did not grant mercy without extracting a steep, punishing price. He had saved her life, which meant she was now bound by an incalculable debt. She expected a brutal interrogation. She expected to be immediately reassigned to the lowest kitchens, forced to scrub pots until her newly healed hands bled all over again to pay for this luxurious room. She lifted her chin, her storm-grey eyes hardening into twin chips of stoic winter ice. She would not beg. She would simply accept her new servitude. Seren watched the defensive micro-expressions shift across her face. He saw the exact moment she braced herself for abuse, the precise second she locked her emotions behind an impenetrable wall of dignified silence. The realization of what she was anticipating hit the massive sovereign like a physical blow to the chest. The golden light in his eyes flared violently with a surge of protective fury, but he immediately forced it down, taking a slow, deep, highly controlled breath. Slowly, deliberately, the Lycan King went down on one knee. The motion was so shocking, so entirely contrary to every established rule of shifter hierarchy, that the young woman actually stopped breathing. The supreme monarch of the northern continent, a man whose mere name made rival alphas sweat with terror, lowered his massive frame until his eye level was perfectly even with hers. As she sat propped up against the pillows, he kept his distance, leaving a wide, safe expanse of empty floor between his kneeling form and the edge of the bed. He placed his large, heavily scarred hands open and flat on his own thighs, explicitly demonstrating that he held no weapons, no chains, and no intentions of grabbing her. It was a gesture of absolute, undeniable surrender. "You are terrified," he said quietly. His voice, this close, was entirely different from the commanding rumble he had used with the healer. It was incredibly soft, incredibly rough, carrying a devastating weight of centuries-old exhaustion. "You are waiting for the catch. You are waiting for me to demand your labor, to ask for your submission, or to punish you for dirtying my sheets." She did not blink. She merely stared at him, her pulse racing, unable to comprehend the situation. "The ancient texts dictate," Seren whispered, his voice dropping to a sacred, reverent cadence of his people, "that the sanctuary demands nothing of the wounded. Listen to me very carefully, Seren Vantrell." Hearing her own name spoken not as a curse, not as a dismissive slur, but as something sacred and incredibly valuable, sent a sharp, painful ache directly into her throat. "You are in Frost Peak Keep," he continued, his striking gaze holding hers with absolute unwavering sincerity. "You are under my direct personal protection. The man who hurt you, the pack that discarded you, they are 1,000 miles beneath you now. They cannot touch you here. They will never touch you again." He slowly closed his eyes, inhaling a deep, ragged breath, allowing his terrifying restraint to crack just a fraction to reveal the profound vulnerability underneath. "You are not here to be used," the king stated, his voice dropping to a fierce, hoarse whisper that vibrated with raw biological truth. "You are not here to be owned. You are chosen. You will never scrub another floor. You will never bind another wound for men who do not appreciate your immense value. You will stay in this room, you will eat, you will sleep, and you will heal. And I will not take a single step closer to this bed until you explicitly ask me to." The quiet woman sat frozen in the golden light. The absolute certainty in his voice, the sheer, staggering reality of a sovereign king, kneeling on hard wooden floorboards just to make a broken outcast feel safe, systematically dismantled her ironclad defenses. Her inner wolf let out a long, shuddering breath, finally daring to uncurl its tense limbs in the presence of his radiating protective heat. She did not smile. She did not weep. But, for the very first time since she had walked away from the Silverglade pack altar, she allowed her rigid spine to relax against the soft velvet pillows, accepting the quiet, safe sanctuary of the cursed monarch. The fire cracked loudly in the massive hearth, sending a shower of bright orange sparks drifting up the dark stone chimney. The ambient temperature of the room was perfectly calibrated, neither overwhelmingly hot nor chillingly cold, creating an atmospheric equilibrium that actively encouraged her exhausted muscles to melt into the mattress. Outside the thick, reinforced glass of the tall arched windows, she could hear the muffled, distant shrieking of the northern blizzard. The violent storm that had nearly claimed her life was still raging with lethal intensity, burying the mountain passes in feet of deadly snow, completely cutting them off from the rest of the world. But inside these heavy walls, surrounded by the scent of cedar and the quiet presence of a kneeling king, the storm felt entirely irrelevant. She observed the physical toll the fated separation was taking on the man before her. Despite his immense power, she could see the fine, violent tremors running through his forearms. She noticed the slight sheen of cold sweat gathering at his temples. The ancient, instinctual laws of their kind dictated that an alpha's beast required immediate physical contact with their newly discovered mate to soothe the chaotic biological awakening. Yet the sovereign deliberately denied his beast that essential relief. He was willingly suffering the physiological agony of distance, choosing to absorb the burning pain of a starving bond rather than force a single unwanted touch upon her traumatized skin. It was a level of emotional discipline and sacrificial restraint that simply did not exist in the brutal hierarchy of her former life. Alpha Thomas had shattered her soul for political convenience, entirely unwilling to endure even a moment of mild embarrassment for her sake. This terrifying Lycan King was willingly enduring physical torture just to ensure she felt in control of her own physical boundaries. She looked down at her hands again. The mint-scented salve was slowly sinking into her skin, leaving behind a soft, warm glow. The deep, jagged calluses that had defined her entire identity as a worthless laborer were already softening. The heavy, crude iron weight of her former servitude was gone, leaving behind only a pale band of unblemished skin where the silver pack ring used to rest. She was no longer an omega of the Silverglade pack. She slowly raised her storm-grey eyes, meeting the intense, molten gaze of the man who had torn her from the jaws of death. She did not offer him a verbal promise. She did not offer him a grateful confession. She merely gave him a single, shallow nod of acknowledgement. It was an incredibly small, guarded gesture, a mere fraction of an inch. But to the Lycan King, who had spent a century starving in the freezing dark, that tiny, silent nod of acceptance was the most monumental victory of his entire cursed existence. Theron's broad chest expanded as he finally took a full, deep breath, his golden eyes glowing softly in the quiet firelight as he settled in for the long, slow, and patient vigil of earning his mate. 72 hours after the public severing of the fated bond, the Silverglade pack was dying. It did not happen as a slow, gradual seasonal shift. It was a sudden, violent, and highly unnatural environmental collapse that struck the territory with the force of a physical plague. The sky above the sprawling pine valleys had turned a permanent, bruised shade of suffocating purple, entirely blocking out the vital warmth of the midday sun. The ambient, invisible magical wards that had safely regulated the local climate for generations were completely gone. In their place, a brutal, punishing frost had crawled rapidly across the earth, choking the life out of every living organism it touched. The ground itself felt brittle, snapping beneath the weight of anyone who dared to walk upon it. The once proud wolves of Silverglade were huddled in the barracks, their teeth chattering uncontrollably as the unnatural frost crept over the stone walls. Pups whimpered in the freezing dark, their mothers unable to provide warmth. The entire ecosystem of the territory was violently collapsing, because the single quiet woman who had anchored its magic was gone. Frost spiderwebs formed across the wooden beams of the pack hall, and the sacred ancestral totems, carved from ancient oak, were splitting down the middle from the sheer, terrifying drop in temperature. Alpha Thomas Sterling stood alone in the center of the communal clearing, his heavy leather boots crunching harshly against the blackened, petrified remains of the winter wheat crop. He was wrapped in 3 layers of thick animal pelts, yet his broad shoulders were hunched defensively against a biting, sub-zero wind that seemed to slice directly through skin and muscle to freeze the marrow beneath. His pale eyes, usually alight with arrogant, undisputed authority, were currently wide with a creeping, nauseating dread. His own breath plumed violently in front of his face, crystallizing before it even vanished. He stared blankly at the pack altar of Silverglade. The massive slab of ancient obsidian was no longer a dark, imposing symbol of his absolute power. It was entirely encased in a thick, jagged layer of cloudy rime ice. Resting on the very top of the frozen stone, perfectly preserved within a block of solid frost, was the heavy, crude metal band he had watched his former mate discard, the silver pack ring. It sat there like a quiet, damning monument to his catastrophic miscalculation. Jackson Vance approached from the edge of the tree line. The loyal Beta did not walk with his usual proud, upright military bearing. He moved stiffly, his arms wrapped tightly around his own chest, his facial hair completely coated in a thick layer of white hoarfrost. The younger man's eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight with the severe physiological strain of trying to maintain his internal body heat in a landscape that was actively trying to kill them. Every exhale he took sounded like a rasping saw against dry wood. "The Southern River is completely frozen," Alpha Jackson reported, his voice a harsh, raspy croak that barely carried over the shrieking wind. "Solid ice all the way down to the riverbed. The fishing stores are lost. The livestock in the lower pens froze to death before sunrise. The central hearth fires in the communal dining hall will not stay lit. No matter how much pitch we pour over the logs, the wood is rejecting the spark." Thomas did not immediately reply. He dragged his heavily gloved hand across his own face, feeling the rigid, frozen stiffness of his own skin. The sheer impossibility of the situation was violently clashing with his rigid, arrogant worldview. Omegas were replaceable. They were meant to be background fixtures, designed for menial labor and quiet submission. Discarding a low-status mate to secure a more politically advantageous alliance was a standard, calculated maneuver in the brutal hierarchy of the shifting world. It was supposed to elevate his absolute authority, not trigger a localized apocalypse. It made no logical sense. "It is the soil," Thomas finally muttered, his voice barely a hollow whisper as he crouched down, digging his gloved fingers into the frozen, blackened mud. "The earth itself is rejecting us. The elders are panicking," the Beta continued, taking a hesitant step closer, his eyes darting nervously toward the frozen ring on the altar. "They are saying the ancient texts warned of this. They are saying the quiet woman was not just a maid. Her daily routines, tending the winter gardens, washing the stone floors, walking the perimeter to forage. She was actively bleeding a latent, ancient grounding magic into the territory with every single step she took. She was the biological anchor holding back the winterbane." The realization hit the Alpha like a physical punch to the sternum. The unseen, completely unappreciated labor that Seren Vantrell had performed in total silence for a decade had not been simple domestic servitude. It had been a highly advanced, instinctual magical warding process. She had been single-handedly absorbing the hostile environmental curses of the mountain, filtering the toxic frost through her own fragile body to keep the arrogant warriors of Silverglade warm and fed. And he had publicly humiliated her. He had systematically hollowed out her soul and banished her into the dark, completely ignorant of the fact that she was the only thing standing between his pack and absolute annihilation. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, Jackson whispered, giving voice to the collective terror that was rapidly spreading through the lower ranks. The trackers lost her scent at the northern ridge 2 days ago. The blizzard completely erased her. "She is not dead," Thomas suddenly roared, the desperate, aggressive sound tearing violently out of his throat as he surged to his feet. His inner beast, severely starved of the stabilizing fated connection and terrified of the encroaching frost, clawed frantically at the inside of his skull. He grabbed Jackson by the front of his heavy furs, lifting the slightly smaller man onto his toes with a terrifying surge of panicked strength. "Do not speak of her as if she is a ghost. She is an Omega, a weak, fragile, wolfless thing. She could not have survived the high passes alone. Someone must have found her. A rival pack, a rogue settlement, someone." Jackson gripped the Alpha's thick wrists, struggling to breathe as the leather collar dug sharply into his windpipe. "Alpha, the high passes belong to the royal territory. If she crossed the Ironstone Ridge, she stepped into the Lycan King's hunting grounds. Nothing survives the Frost Peak borders without royal permission." Thomas's pale eyes dilated wildly, his pupils completely swallowing the irises as a raw, unfiltered surge of biological panic flooded his nervous system. The profound humiliation of realizing he had actively thrown away the most valuable magical asset in the entire province was rapidly mutating into a dangerous, unhinged obsession. He could not lead a dead, frozen pack. He could not maintain his supreme authority if his people starved to death in the dark. He needed her magic. He needed her blood. He needed the quiet, unassuming woman to drop to her knees and fix his monumental mistake. He shoved the beta backward, his chest heaving as his breath plumed in the freezing air. "Gather the elite hunting guard. Take the 20 fastest wolves we possess. You will track her scent beyond the northern ridge. You will tear apart every rogue camp and border settlement until you find her." "And if she refuses to return?" Jackson asked, his voice trembling slightly as he rubbed his bruised throat, deeply unsettled by the manic, desperate light burning in his leader's eyes. "We publicly severed the bond. By the ancient laws, she owes us absolutely nothing. I am the law in this province." The Alpha snarled, his lips curling back to expose a row of sharp, elongated teeth. "I do not care about the ancient texts. I do not care if she weeps, and I do not care if she fights. If you find her breathing, you will put her in iron chains, and you will drag her back to this altar. Go." As Jackson turned and sprinted desperately toward the barracks to organize the tracking party, Thomas turned back to face the frozen obsidian stone. The agonizing cold was beginning to seep through the soles of his heavy boots, creeping steadily up his legs like a suffocating, icy paralysis. The absolute silence of the dying territory pressed heavily against his eardrums. He reached out and violently swept the frozen block containing the silver pack ring off the altar. It shattered against the hardened earth, sending sharp shards of ice scattering into the dead grass. But the profound, echoing emptiness inside his chest remained completely untouched. Hundreds of miles away, elevated far above the brutal, dying frost of the lower valleys, the royal chamber of Frost Peak Keep was a localized sanctuary of perfect, unyielding warmth, a world away. The silence inside the massive stone room was not the suffocating, terrifying quiet of a dying landscape. It was a rich, heavy, and deeply soothing tranquility, punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic crackle of the massive golden hearth fire. The thick, silver-grey tapestries lining the ancient walls successfully absorbed the distant, muffled howling of the high-altitude blizzard, creating an impenetrable atmospheric bubble where the outside world simply ceased to exist. Seren sat up against the plush, velvet pillows of the massive circular bed. She was swathed in the heavy folds of a cedar fur cloak, the dense, luxurious material trapping her own fragile body heat and infusing her skin with a powerful, soothing scent of dark cedar, pine, and molten gold. The contrast between the lethal ice of the Silverglade border and the overwhelming warmth of the sovereign's royal bed was staggering. The transition from a life of brutal, freezing labor to this overwhelming, luxurious stillness was deeply disorienting to her highly guarded nervous system. Every breath she took filled her lungs with warmth, slowly thawing the deep internal ache that had settled into her bones over years of neglect. She had spent the last 2 days completely submerged in the quiet, healing routine established by head healer Elian Thorne. Elian treated her with an absolute meticulous reverence that deeply unsettled her guarded instincts. He did not bark orders. He did not treat her as a disposable, low-status object. He applied thick, mint-scented medical salve with steady hands, ensuring her core body temperature fully stabilized. The dangerous waxy blue tint had entirely vanished from her lips, replaced by a healthy, flush pink. Thanks to the royal medical cast, her hands, once tightly drawn and aching with deep micro-fissures, were now pliant, soft, and completely devoid of the sharp, stinging pain that had plagued her for a decade. The agonizing burn of the severing was healing, carefully patched over by the sheer atmospheric density of the royal magic. But her physical recovery was secondary to the intense, silent observation she was currently conducting. She turned her head slightly, her storm-grey eyes locking onto the far corner of the massive chamber. Lycan King Theron Valerius had not left the room for 48 hours, the supreme monarch of the northern continent, a sovereign whose sheer physical presence was enough to terrify seasoned warlords into absolute submission, was sitting perfectly still in a high-backed leather chair, deliberately keeping a massive expanse of empty floor between himself and her resting place. He was suffering. Shatter possessed the keen, highly attuned observational skills of a woman who had survived her entire life by reading the minute dangerous shifts in the moods of powerful predators. She could clearly see the devastating physical toll his self-imposed restraint was extracting from his massive frame. He had shed his white linen shirt at some point during the long night, unable to tolerate the feeling of fabric against his burning, feverish skin. His broad, heavily muscled chest and heavily scarred torsos were exposed to the firelight, gleaming with a fine, constant sheen of cold sweat. The brutal, jagged lines of his old battles stood out sharply against his skin, evidence of a life lived entirely in violence and isolation. His massive hands gripped the carved wooden armrests of his chair with such terrifying, unyielding force that the dense oak was literally splintering beneath his white knuckles. The heavy muscles in his forearms and shoulders twitched with violent, involuntary spasms. His breathing was incredibly shallow, highly controlled, and completely ragged. His eyes were squeezed tightly shut, his strong jaw clenched so firmly that she could clearly see the rigid outline of the bone pressing against his skin. Every instinct in his body was actively fighting a war against his own willpower. The ancient instinctual rules of the fated bond were absolute biological mandates. His feral, deeply cursed Lycan beast had finally found its anchor after a century of starving isolation. The primal entity inside his blood was screaming for contact. It demanded to cross the room. It demanded to pull her into his arms, to bury its face in the crook of her neck, to saturate her skin with his heavy scent of dark cedar and molten gold, and to physically claim her as his sole territory. The sheer, overwhelming biological urge to simply touch his mate was threatening to tear his mind apart, flooding his nervous system with an agonizing demand for proximity. Yet, he absolutely refused to move. He had promised he would not take a single step closer to her bed until she explicitly permitted it. In a world where alphas routinely used brute force, political coercion, and terrifying dominance to extract exactly what they wanted from weaker omegas, This all-powerful king was actively choosing to endure sheer, unrelenting physiological agony rather than risk triggering her severe trauma. He was deliberately swallowing the burning pain of a starving bond to guarantee her absolute physical autonomy. The realization settled deep into Seren's chest, completely bypassing her analytical, guarded human mind and resonating directly with her recovering inner wolf, her spiritual beast, which had been violently crushed into a dormant ball of agony by Thomas's public betrayal, opened its bright, ethereal eyes. It did not whimper in fear. It let out a soft, low, and deeply curious hum, recognizing the profound, sacrificial nature of the predator across the room. It sensed his restraint, his terrifying strength chained voluntarily to the floor. We are small things in a world of teeth. She had lived her entire life by that terrifying, cynical truth. But the man bleeding his own willpower dry in the corner of the room was not baring his teeth at her. He was actively breaking his own jaw to keep her safe. Seren took a slow, deep breath, tasting the rich, intoxicating aroma of pine and hearth fire that constantly radiated from his skin. Stepping with deliberate, practiced quietness, she pushed the heavy layers of velvet and fur blankets aside. The physical movement was tiny, but the rustle of the thick fabric sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet chamber. Theron's massive frame went completely, terrifyingly rigid, his head snapped up, his eyes flying open. The storm-grey depths were almost entirely swallowed by a swirling, violent and desperate molten gold. His pupils dilated rapidly as he tracked her movement, his massive chest freezing mid-inhalation as he forced his body to remain glued to the leather chair. "Do not," the king ground out, his voice a harsh, gravelly whisper that vibrated with immense, agonizing restraint. He immediately dropped his gaze, staring fixedly at the stone floorboards between his heavy boots, terrified that direct eye contact would be interpreted as a predatory challenge. "You do not have to move. If my proximity is overwhelming your senses, simply say the word, and I will leave this keep entirely." Seren did not speak. She swung her legs over the edge of the high mattress and let her bare feet drop to the floor. The polished stone was incredibly warm, heated from below by the elaborate hypercaust systems of the ancient royal architecture. She stood up. Her body felt strangely light, completely unburdened by the heavy wool and the crushing invisible weight of her former servitude. She wore only a simple, flowing white sleep shift provided by the medical staff, a garment that draped softly over her slender, healing frame. She took a step forward. Theron's breathing completely stopped. He squeezed his eyes shut again, his broad shoulders curling slightly inward in a desperate physical attempt to make his massive, intimidating form appear smaller, less threatening. The sheer vulnerability of the gesture from a warlord capable of leveling cities was deeply, profoundly beautiful. Seren crossed the vast expanse of the chamber. Her bare feet made absolutely no sound against the heated stone. She did not rush, nor did she hesitate. She moved with the quiet, flawless grace of a woman who finally understood her own monumental worth. She stopped directly in front of his chair. The intense, radiating heat coming off his feverish skin was palpable, wrapping around her like a heavy, invisible blanket. She looked down at his trembling, white-knuckled hands gripping the splintered wood. The scars on his knuckles were older and far more brutal than her own, telling a silent story of a century spent fighting a lonely, endless war against his own cursed nature. She was no longer a tool or a possession, but an equal. With absolute, unwavering calmness, Seren extended her right hand. Her fingers, still bearing the faint silvery traces of her old calluses, moved through the quiet air. She did not ask for permission, and she did not offer a verbal warning. She simply laid her open palm flat against the bare, heated skin of his heavily corded forearm. The biological impact was instantaneous, catastrophic, and deeply miraculous. The exact millisecond her cool, grounding skin made direct contact with his feverish flesh, a violent, harmonic shockwave of pure energy detonated through both of their nervous systems. A phantom heat flared against her collarbone. The mating mark burned. The sensation was not painful, but a brilliant, searing affirmation of existence. The feral, chaotic storm that had been violently tearing through Theron's veins for 100 years completely and instantly flatlined. The agonizing, burning hunger in his blood vanished, replaced by a profound, rushing wave of absolute, rhythmic peace. The terrifying, supreme predator inside his mind let out a long, heavy sigh and instantly dropped to its belly, completely subdued, completely tamed by the gentle weight of her small hand. Theron exhaled. It was a long, shuddering, entirely broken breath that seemed to empty his massive chest of a century's worth of isolated grief. The violent tremors racking his muscles ceased immediately, his white-knuckled grip on the armrests unspooled, his large, lethal fingers relaxing until they hung loosely toward the floor. He did not surge upward. He did not aggressively grab her or force her into a dominant embrace. The Lycan King simply let his massive head fall forward, his broad shoulders slumping as he bowed his face until his forehead rested gently against the carved wooden armrest, mere inches from where her hand anchored him to reality. His slate-colored eyes, now completely clear of the violent feral gold, fluttered shut as he focused entirely on the simple, overwhelming sensation of her touch. Seren did not pull away. She stood quietly in the golden light of the roaring hearth, her thumb making a microscopic soothing motion against the hard muscle of his arm. The crushing, terrifying noise of her old life, the arrogant shouts of Alpha Thomas, and the freezing horror of the mountain blizzard were entirely gone. In the absolute silence of the royal keep, watching the most feared sovereign on the continent completely surrender to her quiet presence, she finally recognized the truth. She had not been rescued by a monster. She was the only entity in the world capable of giving the monster a safe place to rest. Shifting his weight with deliberate, agonizing care so as not to startle her, Theron slid his massive frame entirely out of the high-backed leather chair. He did not rise to his full, towering height. Instead, the most powerful Lycan King in history lowered himself to the heated stone floor, dropping heavily onto one knee before her bare feet. He kept his large, scarred hands strictly to himself, resting his palms flat against his own thighs. It was a clear, unmistakable, physical demonstration of his absolute respect for her physical boundaries. He tilted his broad chin upward and bared the side of his throat to her guarded gaze, exposing his lethal vulnerability in complete unconditional surrender as he waited patiently in the quiet hearth warmth for her to speak. The silence in the royal chamber stretched into something thick, sacred, and deeply resonant. Seren stared down at the bared throat of the massive monarch. She could clearly see the steady, powerful thrum of his pulse beneath the tanned, scarred skin. It was an offering of absolute trust from a predator who had spent a century trusting absolutely no one. The sheer gravity of the gesture anchored her floating, traumatized consciousness firmly to the present moment. The phantom agony of the obsidian altar, the howling of the blizzard, the cruel dismissal in Thomas's pale eyes, all of it seemed to dissolve in the overwhelming, radiant heat of the man kneeling on the stone before her. Her inner wolf, previously crushed into a dormant, shivering ball of misery, cautiously approached the forefront of her mind. The spiritual beast did not cower. Instead, it pressed its metaphorical nose against the heavy, intoxicating scent of dark cedar and pine that saturated the air, letting out a soft, approving rumble. It recognized the safety being offered. It recognized the monumental strength required for a sovereign to sheath his claws and bare his neck to a broken outcast. Seren slowly withdrew her hand from his forearm. The loss of physical contact caused a microscopic flinch to ripple across Theron's broad shoulders, a brief spike of instinctual panic, but he remained perfectly still, honoring his promise of restraint. She did not step back. She stood her ground, her bare feet absorbing the comforting heat of the warm stone floor. "You are asking a woman who has only known cages to trust a mountain," Seren said quietly. Her voice was slightly raspy from the freezing winds she had swallowed, but it did not waver. It was steady, carrying the quiet, enduring strength of a root breaking through solid stone. Theron slowly raised his massive head, his piercing eyes, now completely clear of the violent feral gold, locked onto hers. The deep exhaustion etched into the sharp lines of his face was staggering, yet there was a desperate, burning hope simmering just beneath the surface. "Then the mountain will remain entirely still," the king rumbled, his deep baritone vibrating softly in the quiet room, "until you decide you are ready to climb." He did not push for a grand declaration. He did not demand an immediate enforcement of the fated bond. The supreme ruler of all shifters simply acknowledged her boundary with a slow, respectful nod, pushing himself back up to his feet. He towered over her, casting a long, protective shadow against the firelight, but he deliberately kept his hands clasped firmly behind his back. The physical distance he maintained was a profound, daily choice, a continuous sacrifice of his own physical comfort to ensure her psychological safety. "Rest," Theron murmured, his gaze lingering on her pale face for one heartbeat longer, before he turned toward the heavy oak doors. "The keep is yours. The servants will bring you whatever you desire. No one will enter without your explicit permission, not even me." When the heavy iron latch clicked shut, leaving her alone in the golden-lit sanctuary, Seren did not immediately return to the velvet blankets. She stood by the roaring hearth, watching the bright orange sparks drift up the dark chimney. For the first time in a decade, she did not have to listen for the heavy boots of a demanding alpha. She did not have to brace herself for a physical blow or a sharp reprimand. The silence of the royal keep was not the terrifying quiet of a predator stalking its prey. It was the peaceful, heavy stillness of a fortress designed specifically to keep her safe. She closed her eyes, letting the rich scent of cedar wrap around her exhausted frame, and finally, deeply, allowed herself to breathe. The royal chamber was vastly different from the cramped, drafty servant quarters of the Silverglade pack. Every architectural detail in Frost Peak Keep seemed designed to contrast the brutal cold of the northern continent. The walls were draped in heavy, dark crimson tapestries that absorbed the violent shrieks of the ongoing blizzard outside, transforming the lethal storm into a distant, muffled hum. She reached out, her fingertips brushing against the intricately woven wool. Her hands, which had spent years plunged into icy water and freezing dirt, did not tremble. They were steady, the heavy iron and silver weight that used to drag down her left hand. The silver pack ring she had abandoned on the obsidian altar was gone. The phantom weight of it still haunted her knuckles, a physical memory of her enslavement, but the skin beneath was bare. She was untethered. She was entirely her own. She moved toward the massive arched window. The thick, storm-glass panes were laced with spidery patterns of ice on the outside, but the interior surface was perfectly warm to the touch. Beyond the glass, the mountain was a chaotic, swirling void of white. The blizzard raged with a terrifying, apocalyptic fury. Somewhere out there, the territory that had cast her away was suffocating under the very same ice. But here, standing wrapped in the king's heavy cedar fur cloak, she was entirely untouched by the frost. By the time the pale, diffused light of the morning sun managed to pierce through the thick, howling blizzard, the atmosphere within the chamber had settled into a steady, healing calm. A soft, hesitant knock at the heavy oak doors broke the silence. Seren, seated in a high-backed chair near the window, wrapped the heavy cedar fur cloak tighter around her shoulders and gave a quiet word of permission. Elian Thorne entered the room with his usual meticulous, unhurried grace. The head royal healer carried a small silver tray holding fresh linen bandages and a steaming cup of high-country herbal broth. He bowed deeply before approaching, keeping his movements smooth and entirely predictable. He did not look at her with the dismissive contempt the Silverglade medics always reserved for Omegas. He looked at her as if she were made of spun glass and ancient magic. "Good morning, my lady," Elian said softly, setting the tray down on a small wooden table. "I apologize for the intrusion. I must assess the final stages of your physical mending." Seren nodded, offering him her hands. The deep, jagged micro-fissures that had mapped the history of her unappreciated labor were completely gone. The waxy, terrifying blue tint of frostbite had been entirely replaced by a healthy, vibrant flush of returning circulation. The doctor examined her fingers with a gentle, professional touch, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. "The knitting of the flesh is proceeding at a miraculous rate," he noted, his voice colored with genuine, hushed awe. "The localized frost damage is entirely reversed. But more importantly, it is the spiritual trauma that I must evaluate." He asked her to tilt her head to the side, exposing the sensitive skin at the base of her neck, where the fated mate bond tethered the soul to the physical body. When Alpha Thomas Sterling had violently severed the connection at the obsidian altar, the area had felt as though someone had poured liquid iron directly onto her spinal cord. The lingering scent of rotting ash had clung to her skin like a physical curse. Elian hovered his hand over the area, his eyes closing as he tapped into the subtle, diagnostic magic of the medical cast. A soft sigh of profound relief escaped his lips. "The void is gone," he whispered, opening his eyes to look at her with deep reverence. "The catastrophic severing you endured should have left a permanent, necrotic scar on your inner beast. It should have taken years of deep spiritual mending and restorative ritual to simply stop the internal bleeding. But the spiritual wound is entirely closed, the ambient magic of the keep, the proximity of the Royal Alpha. It has acted as a flawless mystic binding." Seren reached up, her own fingers brushing against the smooth skin of her neck. There was no pain. The hollow, freezing ache was completely absent. In its place there was a faint, steady, rhythmic warmth, a pulsing echo of the powerful, cedar-scented heartbeat that had carried her up the mountain. "You are fully healed, Seren Vantrell," Elian confirmed, stepping back and offering another deep bow. "Physically and spiritually, you are completely whole." After the healer departed, leaving her with the steaming cup of broth, the quiet woman remained by the window. The blizzard outside showed absolutely no signs of stopping, the furious whiteout erasing the treacherous mountain passes. She thought of the Silverglade pack. She thought of the cold, muddy floors she used to scrub, the bitter winter gardens she tended until her hands bled, and the complete, suffocating lack of gratitude from the people she had kept warm. They had looked at her quiet endurance and seen only weakness. They had looked at her stoic dignity and mistaken it for a lack of value. They were entirely wrong. A familiar, heavy shift in the air pressure signaled the Sovereign's return. Theron Valerius stepped into the chamber, moving with the silent, predatory grace that defined his massive frame. He stopped at his self-imposed boundary, exactly 10 paces from her chair, his stormy eyes carefully scanning her relaxed posture. He was dressed in dark leathers, the faint scent of winter wind clinging to his broad shoulders, but the ferocious aura of his beast was tightly leashed in her presence. "Elian reports that the healing is complete," Theron stated, his deep voice maintaining that careful, guarded restraint. "You are physically strong enough to travel, if that is your wish. I have prepared a secure carriage and an elite royal escort. I can have you safely transported to any territory on the continent. You will be provided with enough wealth to ensure you never have to work another day in your life. You are free." Seren turned her head to look at him. He was offering her the ultimate escape. He was handing her the absolute autonomy that her former alpha had violently stripped away. Yet, looking at the immense, terrifying monarch who was actively holding his breath, waiting for her decision, she saw the raw, devastating vulnerability hiding behind his ironclad discipline. He was fully prepared to let her walk out of the keep, prepared to endure the catastrophic agony of a starving fated bond for the rest of his cursed life, simply because he refused to cage her. She stood up, the royal furs draped heavily around her slender form, the rich scent of pine and molten gold wrapping her in an invisible shield. She walked toward him, crossing the 10 paces without a single ounce of hesitation. Theron's jaw tightened, his massive hands curling into fists at his sides, as he fought the desperate, primal urge to close the remaining distance. His knuckles turned stark white against his tanned skin. When she stood mere inches from his broad chest, she looked up into his eyes. She did not flinch from the dangerous, swirling gold flakes trapped within the storm-grey depths. She saw the monster, and she saw the man who had chained the monster for her sake. "The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten," Seren said softly, her voice steady and clear. "The altars were where you went to be broken. I have spent my entire life being pushed aside, discarded, and instructed that my quietness was a liability. I will not run away from the only place that has ever asked me to stay." Theron stopped breathing entirely. "I reject the carriage," she continued, her gaze locking onto his with absolute, unwavering certainty. "I reject the escort. I am not leaving." The Lycan King let out a harsh, tearing exhale. His massive hands, which had crushed solid stone and broken enemy lines, came up slowly, trembling visibly as they hovered just millimeters from her shoulders. He was still terrified of bruising her. Seren lifted her own hands and gently rested her palms against his chest, right over his hammering heart. "Not used," she whispered, echoing his own sacred vow back to him. "Not owned, chosen." The words shattered the final remnants of Theron's agonizing restraint. With a deep, chest-rattling groan, he carefully wrapped his muscular arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his massive frame. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling her scent of wild snowdrops with a desperate, starving hunger. He did not bite. He did not force a claiming mark. He simply held her with a fierce, unconditional reverence, the most powerful predator in the realm, completely subdued by the quiet strength of the woman in his arms. The fated bond, previously a chaotic storm of unfulfilled instinct, settled into a deep, rhythmic, and unbreakable harmony. She was safe. She was home. While the royal chamber remained an absolute sanctuary of warmth and quiet healing, the base of the mountain was descending into a violent, frozen hell. The blizzard that had scoured the northern ridge was completely merciless. At the very edge of the Frost Peak territory, where the ancient, jagged ironstone markers delineated the border of the northern ruler's absolute domain, a desperate, half-frozen contingent of 20 elite Silverglade trackers finally arrived. Jackson Vance trudged at the head of the miserable column. He was barely recognizable. His usually proud, upright military bearing had been entirely crushed by the sheer, unforgiving brutality of the winterbane that had followed them up the mountain. His heavy animal pelts were encrusted with a thick, solid layer of rime ice. His breath wheezed in his lungs, each exhalation a ragged, painful struggle against the sub-zero air. The 20 elite wolves behind him, the proudest warriors of the dying pack, were stumbling blindly through the knee-deep snowdrifts, their faces numb, their internal magic completely depleted by the unnatural, lethal frost. They had tracked the faint, lingering scent of burnt ash and wild snowdrops for 3 agonizing days, driven entirely by the manic, desperate orders of their alpha. Thomas Sterling had demanded they return the quiet Omega in iron chains. He had demanded they drag her back to the obsidian altar to fix the apocalyptic environmental collapse that was actively freezing their home territory into a permanent, lifeless grave. He refused to believe that the woman he threw away was the very magic keeping them alive. Jackson stopped at the massive, towering structure that guarded the sole entrance to the Royal Mountain Keep. The gates of Frost Peak were not made of simple wood and stone. They were forged from solid, black cold iron soaring 50 feet into the bruised, howling sky, heavily reinforced with ancient Lycan wards that hummed with a terrifying latent lethality. The sheer scale of the architecture was designed to humble anyone who approached, a stark, physical reminder of the supreme authority of the warlord who ruled the northern continent. Jackson swallowed the freezing air, his throat painfully dry. He raised a trembling, heavily gloved fist and struck the massive iron gate. The sound was a dull, pathetic thud that was instantly swallowed by the shrieking wind. He tried again, summoning the last desperate reserves of his physical strength to pound against the frozen metal. "Open!" Jackson yelled, his voice cracking horribly. "In the name of Alpha Thomas Sterling of the Silverglade Pack, open these gates. We claim the ancient right of retrieval." The wind howled in response, mocking his absolute insignificance. The 20 trackers huddled closer together, their teeth chattering violently, their eyes darting nervously toward the high, dark battlements. They were completely exhausted, operating entirely on the fear of their alpha's wrath, but deep down, every single wolf in the party knew they were standing on a graveyard. No one demanded anything from the Lycan King. For a long, agonizing minute, there was absolutely no response. The heavy snowfall continued to bury their boots. Jackson was just about to order a retreat, to accept the inevitable death of his pack rather than face the wrath of the mountain, when a deep, mechanical grinding sound echoed through the canyon. The massive iron gates did not swing open wide. A smaller, heavy postern door forged directly into the base of the primary gate slowly clicked open, the heavy iron hinges groaning against the thick ice. The temperature in the immediate vicinity did not rise. It plummeted. A suffocating, terrifying wave of absolute, supreme predatory dominance rolled out of the dark opening, slamming into the exhausted Silverglade wolves with the physical force of a solid brick wall. Several of the elite trackers immediately dropped to their knees in the snow, their inner beasts whimpering in sheer, unadulterated primal terror. Their bodies instinctively recognized the presence of an apex entity, forcing them into a state of involuntary, absolute submission. Lycan King Theron Valerius stepped out into the blizzard. He was not wearing his warm furs. He was dressed in standard, immaculate dark battle leathers, his broad shoulders squared, his posture radiating a cold, lethal, and effortless authority. He did not carry a sword. He did not bring a massive contingent of heavily armed royal guards. He stepped out entirely alone, his sheer physical size and the terrifying, molten intensity of his aura more than enough to completely crush the meager authority of the 20 freezing wolves before him. The raging blizzard seemed to physically break around him, the violent winds diverting their course rather than daring to touch his skin. He stopped 3 paces from the intruding Jackson. The sheer height difference forced the smaller man to tilt his head back, exposing his throat to the storm-grey eyes that were currently devoid of any mercy or warmth. "You are trespassing on sovereign soil," Theron rumbled. He did not shout. He did not need to raise his voice over the storm. His deep baritone carried a concussive, vibrating weight that resonated directly in the marrow of the intruder's bones. "State your business, or I will let the mountain bury you where you stand." Jackson forced himself to remain standing, though his knees were trembling violently. He drew a ragged breath, clinging desperately to the political protocols that had governed his entire life. "We seek the runaway Omega," he rasped out, his breath plumbing in the freezing air. "Her departure has caused a severe magical destabilization within our territory. Alpha Thomas formally demands her immediate return to the Silverglade Pack." Theron's expression did not change. Not a single muscle in his scarred, handsome face twitched, but the ambient air pressure dropped so severely that Jackson's ears popped painfully. The storm-grey eyes of the monarch slowly bled into a vibrant, terrifying molten gold. "Your Alpha publicly severed the sacred fated bond," the king stated, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that sent a fresh wave of primal terror through the kneeling trackers. "He deliberately broke her soul. He stripped her of her rank, discarded her protection, and watched her walk into a lethal winter storm to die. And now, because his precious crops are freezing, he sends his battered hounds to drag her back in chains. Jackson swallowed hard, realizing with absolute horrifying clarity that the Lycan King already knew every single detail of the betrayal at the obsidian altar. It is a matter of pack jurisdiction, Your Majesty. By the ancient treaties. The ancient treaties do not apply to my queen. The 5 words fell into the howling silence of the blizzard like heavy, crushing iron anvils. Jackson physically staggered backward, his eyes widening in absolute shock. The elite trackers behind him let out collective, strangled gasps of disbelief. The quiet, unappreciated woman who scrubbed their floors and tended their bitter gardens, the Omega they had openly mocked for a decade, Queen. Seren Vantrell is no longer an outcast. Seren continued, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, protective fury that promised absolute annihilation to anyone who dared to question his claim. She is not your anchor. She is not your servant. She is the supreme sovereign of this continent, under my direct, personal, and absolute protection. She belongs to Frost Peak now. Thomas will not accept this. Jackson blurted out, a desperate, foolish lapse in judgment driven by pure panic. He will appeal to the High Council. He will demand. Seren moved with a supernatural, blurring speed that the human eye simply could not track. In a fraction of a second, the Sovereign had closed the distance, his massive, calloused hand wrapping like a steel vise around the intruder's throat. He lifted Jackson Vance clean off the ground, effortlessly holding the struggling, heavily armored man suspended in the freezing air with a single arm. The 20 trackers behind him cried out, instinctively reaching for their weapons, but a single, terrifying snarl from Theron's bared fangs froze them entirely in place. The raw, unfiltered killing intent radiating from the monarch was absolute. It was the aura of a warlord who had buried entire armies for far less of an insult. "Listen to me very carefully," Seren whispered, his molten gold eyes locking onto Jackson's terrified, bulging pupils. "I do not care about your High Council. I do not care about your dying territory. If Thomas Sterling steps one single foot within 50 miles of this mountain, I will not bother with treaties. I will personally descend upon Silverglade. I will tear his arrogant head from his shoulders, and I will burn what is left of your freezing pack to the ground." He squeezed slightly, just enough to let the man feel the lethal, crushing power in his grip before releasing his hold entirely. Jackson collapsed into the deep snowdrift, gasping violently for air, his hands clutching his bruised throat. He looked up at the terrifying monarch, fully understanding that the era of Silverglade's arrogance was permanently over. They had discarded a quiet stone, entirely unaware it was the keystone holding up their entire world. "Return to your Alpha," Theron commanded, his voice returning to that cold, effortless authority. "Tell Thomas Sterling that the woman he threw away is currently sleeping in my royal bed, wrapped in my furs, and completely untouchable. Remind your Alpha that his Winterbane is the exact price of his own cruelty, and make it explicitly clear that the Lycan King does not share." Without waiting for a response, Theron turned his back on the pathetic, freezing contingent. He stepped back through the postern door, the heavy cold iron swinging shut behind him with a massive, echoing boom that shook the very foundations of the canyon. The heavy deadbolts slid into place with a terrifying finality. Jackson Vance remained kneeling in the snow, staring at the impenetrable black iron gates. The howling wind of the blizzard immediately intensified, burying the tracks of the elite wolves, leaving them completely alone in the freezing dark. The brutal banishment at the altar had been designed to crush her entirely. Instead, it had unleashed the absolute, devastating wrath of a supreme predator, and the Silver Glade Pack was about to pay the ultimate price. 2 weeks after the public severing at the obsidian altar, Alpha Thomas Sterling was finally forced to climb the mountain himself. Every single step he took toward the towering black spires of Frost Peak Keep was a brutal, agonizing reminder of his own colossal miscalculation. The freezing wind screamed through the jagged canyons, tearing at his thick furs and slicing across his exposed cheeks like invisible blades of glass. This was not a mountain meant for lower valley wolves. The atmospheric pressure alone was suffocating, heavy with the ambient, primal magic of the Supreme Sovereign's absolute domain. Thomas could feel his inner beast recoiling with every agonizing mile, shrinking away from the immense territorial dominance that saturated the very stones beneath his ice-caked boots. The Winterbane had not merely crippled his territory, it had systematically executed it. The vibrant, sprawling pine valleys were now nothing more than a petrified, brittle graveyard of blackened timber and solid ice. The surviving members of his pack were starving, huddled around dying embers that absolutely refused to hold a spark, their eyes hollow with the terrifying realization that their arrogant leader had condemned them all. Jackson had returned from the northern border, physically broken and psychologically shattered, delivering a message so utterly incomprehensible that the Alpha's mind had simply refused to process it. Seren, the quiet, unremarkable maid who scrubbed their stone floors until her knuckles bled, the woman he had discarded like useless refuse, was supposedly sharing the bed of the Lycan King. Thomas refused to believe it. It defied every brutal established law of shifter hierarchy. Supreme monarchs did not claim broken omegas. They did not elevate the weak. He convinced himself that Theron Valerius had captured her, recognizing her latent grounding magic, and was holding her as a political hostage to extract crippling tribute from the lower valleys. Driven by absolute desperation and a manic, unyielding pride, the former mate marched into the lethal blizzard, determined to negotiate the return of his stolen property. The ascent was a grueling, agonizing physical torment. The brutal, sub-zero winds ripped through his heavy animal pelts, freezing the sweat against his skin and numbing his extremities until he could no longer feel his own hands. By the time he reached the massive, towering structure of the black, cold iron gates, his lips were cracked and bleeding, his breathing a harsh, metallic rasp in the empty canyon. He fully expected to be turned away, to be forced to fight the royal guard for a mere audience. Instead, the heavy postern door swung open in absolute terrifying silence, granting him immediate, uncontested entry. It was not a gesture of respect. It was the quiet, deliberate opening of an executioner's trap. The transition from the shrieking, lethal freeze of the mountain to the interior of Frostpeak Keep was profoundly shocking. The air inside the ancient stone corridors was thick, heavy, and saturated with an overwhelming, luxurious warmth that made Thomas's frost-bitten skin burn with sharp, agonizing static. Royal guards clad in immaculate silver and grey armor lined the halls, their expressions completely devoid of emotion as they watched the shivering, desperate Alpha stumble past them. The intense radiating scent of dark cedar, mountain pine, and molten gold permeated every single breath he took, an atmospheric weight that actively pressed down on his chest, demanding instinctual submission. He was led directly into the royal throne room. The sheer architectural scale of the chamber was designed to crush the ego of any visiting dignitary. Massive pillars of polished obsidian stretched upward into a vaulted ceiling lost in the shadows. Enormous braziers of wrought iron burned with bright roaring fires, casting dancing golden light across the rich crimson tapestries lining the walls. Hundreds of elite courtiers, generals, and high-born wolves stood in perfect, disciplined silence, creating a suffocating corridor of hostile predatory eyes. They were apex predators, the absolute elite of the shifter hierarchy, and they looked at the intruding Alpha as if he were nothing more than a pathetic, lost pup wandering into a dragon's den. At the far end of the immense hall, elevated upon a sweeping dais of polished marble, sat the royal silver throne. Thomas walked forward. His heavy, ice-caked boots echoed pathetically against the pristine floorboards. He kept his gaze locked on the dais, expecting to find the terrifying warlord sitting in judgment, perhaps with the quiet woman chained at his feet or cowering in the shadows. He opened his mouth, his tongue thick and clumsy, preparing to invoke the ancient treaties of territorial retrieval. He looked up. The words died instantly in his throat, choking him with the force of a physical blow. Seated upon the ancient massive seat of the Lycan Empire was not the terrifying sovereign, it was Seren. The visual paradigm shift was so violent, so utterly catastrophic to his rigid worldview, that Thomas actually stumbled, his knees buckling slightly before he caught himself. She was entirely transformed, yet fundamentally, devastatingly the same. She was not draped in gaudy, ostentatious jewels, nor was she heavily painted to mask her origins. She wore an elegant flowing gown of heavy silver-grey silk that pooled beautifully around her feet. The massive, intimidating cedar fur cloak, the undeniable physical manifestation of the king's absolute protection, was draped casually over her slender shoulders, swallowing her in its rich, dark pelts. But it was not the royal garments that paralyzed him, it was her posture. The young woman sat with a perfectly straight spine, her chin lifted in an expression of flawless, untouchable dignity. Her hands, still bearing the faint, silvery lines of the deep micro-fissures from her years of unappreciated labor, rested flat against the velvet armrests with the quiet, supreme authority of a deity passing silent judgment. Standing immediately to her right, towering over the dais like a lethal living shadow, was Theron Valerius. The Lycan King did not sit. He stood guard. One massive, heavily scarred hand rested gently on the carved back of the silver throne, his broad shoulders squared, his lethal gaze locked onto the approaching intruder. With a terrifying, unfiltered killing intent, the aura radiating from the monarch was not merely dominant, it was apocalyptic. It was the raw, protective fury of an apex predator standing over his most sacred treasure. The crushing weight of that aura slammed into Thomas, his own inner beast, deeply starved of magic and exhausted by the freezing climb, whimpered pathetically and completely collapsed, forcing the Alpha to his knees at the base of the marble steps. The humiliating sound of his knees striking the hard stone echoed loudly in the silent court. He gasped for air, his voice cracking horribly, completely stripped of its usual booming arrogance. He stared up at the dais, his pale eyes wide with a manic, desperate disbelief. He searched her face for a single trace of the submissive, terrified maid he had discarded at the obsidian altar. He dug through his own fuzzy, imperfect memories of her scrubbing the keep, trying to reconcile the woman in rags with the sovereign draped in silk. He searched for anger, for sorrow, for anything that would validate his past authority over her. There was absolutely nothing. Her storm-grey eyes were entirely clear, hardened like ancient winter ice. She looked down at the shivering, broken man kneeling before her throne, and she did not see a terrifying Alpha. She saw exactly what he was. A small, cruel, short-sighted creature who had entirely destroyed his own world. "The Silverglade pack is dying," Thomas pleaded, the desperation finally shattering his pride. As the suffocating silence of the room pressed in on him, his breath hitched in his chest. "The Winterbane has taken the southern river. The crops are petrified. The pups are freezing in the dark. You are the grounding anchor. You must return. The ancient texts dictate." "You do not possess the right to invoke the texts," Theron rumbled. The deep, vibrating baritone rolled across the cavernous room, shaking the very dust from the vaulted ceiling. The king did not raise his voice, but the sheer, concussive authority in his tone made several of the courtiers flinch. "You severed the sacred tie. You stood before your people and declared her entirely worthless. You threw a flawless diamond into the frozen mud because you lacked the basic intellectual capacity to understand its value." "She belongs to my territory," the intruder shouted, a pathetic final surge of delusional possession flaring in his chest as he gripped the edge of the marble steps. "I raised her, I fed her. She owes us her life." Seren did not shout back. She did not defend herself. She slowly leaned forward, the heavy silk of her gown rustling softly in the quiet room. Her expression remained perfectly, devastatingly calm. "The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her," she said softly, but the acoustics of the grand hall carried her clear, steady voice to every single listening ear. "You brought me to the altar to demonstrate your supreme power. You expected me to crawl. Instead, you merely opened the cage." Thomas stared at her, his jaw trembling, the absolute horrifying reality of his monumental mistake finally tearing through his manic denial. She was never weak. Her silence had never been submission. It had been endurance. And now, elevated far beyond his pathetic reach, that endurance had become an impenetrable fortress. "I owe you absolutely nothing," the Queen stated, her voice as smooth and lethal as drawn steel. "I left my silver pack ring on your frozen stone. I left my servitude in the dark. You are a stranger to me now, Thomas Sterling, and your dying pack is the exact, unavoidable harvest of the seeds you chose to plant." The absolute finality in her quiet declaration stripped the remaining oxygen from his lungs. The broken man slumped forward, his heavily gloved hands pressing flat against the cold marble floor, as a wave of severe physiological shock crashed through his nervous system. The arrogant ruler who had demanded absolute obedience from his people was currently hyperventilating at the feet of the woman he had treated as dirt. The sheer, overwhelming humiliation of the moment was absolute, playing out in front of the entire, silent royal court. But the Lycan King was not finished. Theron Valerius stepped away from his position behind the royal silver's throne. He moved with a slow, deliberate, predatory grace, his massive frame radiating an intense, molten heat that aggressively pushed back the lingering chill the former mate had dragged into the room. The sovereign stopped at the very edge of the dais, looking down at the shivering figure with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. "You came to my mountain demanding the return of a servant," the monarch declared, his voice cutting through the thick, tense air like a heavy executioner's blade. "You demanded I hand over the woman who saved my cursed soul, simply so she could bleed her magic into the dirt to keep your pathetic fires lit. You lack the vision to see a queen, so I will make her status undeniably, biologically permanent." Theron turned his back on the kneeling intruder. He walked back up the shallow marble steps, his intense stare locking entirely onto the quiet woman seated on the throne. The terrifying lethal warlord aura completely vanished the exact second his gaze met hers, replaced instantly by a raw, overwhelming tide of absolute devotion. The entire court held its collective breath. He went down on one knee directly in front of the silver seat. He ignored the hundreds of elite spectators. He ignored the desperate, whimpering man behind him. The universe narrowed down to the small, steady hands resting on the velvet armrests. He slowly reached out, his massive, heavily scarred fingers gently cradling the sides of her face. His touch was impossibly light, practically trembling with the immense, sacrificial restraint he had practiced for 2 weeks. He did not demand. He simply waited. Seren looked into the swirling golden depths of his eyes. She saw the century of agonizing isolation, the cursed existence of a predator starving in the dark, and the absolute, unwavering promise of a safe sanctuary. She did not hesitate. With a slow, graceful movement, she tilted her head sharply to the side, completely exposing the highly sensitive, vulnerable pulse point at the juncture of her neck and shoulder. A deep, chest-rattling groan tore from Theron's throat, a sound of such profound, instinctual relief that it made the ambient magic in the room physically vibrate. The ambient temperature in the grand hall spiked violently as the king's Lycan magic surged to the surface, rippling through the heavy air in visible waves of golden heat. The sheer intensity of it would have suffocated any other wolf, but to Seren it felt like coming home. It felt like standing before a massive, roaring hearth after a lifetime of freezing in the desolate dark. His elongated fangs slipped past his lips. He leaned forward, his broad chest pressing against her knees, and sank his teeth directly into her bared flesh. The physical reaction was catastrophic and miraculous. It was not a brutal bite of dominance. It was a sacred, ancient fusion of souls. A blinding, radiating wave of harmonic energy exploded outward from the dais, violently washing over every single individual in the grand hall. The heavy, intoxicating scent of wild snowdrops entirely merged with the rich aroma of dark cedar and molten gold, creating a unified, overpowering fragrance that definitively marked the territory. The golden pulsing thread of the fated bond, previously a gentle, healing tether, suddenly flared into a massive, unbreakable cable of pure biological fire. For the young woman, there was absolutely no pain. The lingering, phantom ache of the severed connection at the obsidian altar was instantly, violently incinerated by a rushing tide of liquid warmth. The searing heat of the Lycan mating mark spread rapidly through her nervous system, anchoring her spiritual beast permanently to the massive, protective entity kneeling before her. Her inner wolf let out a long, joyous howl that echoed silently in the vast chambers of her mind, completely secure, completely cherished. Thomas witnessed the entire process, the visual and magical proof that his former mate was now biologically, spiritually, and legally bound to the supreme ruler of the continent was the final, devastating blow. The intense, radiating heat of the true fated bond actually burned his retinas, forcing him to squeeze his eyes shut as a pathetic, broken sob finally tore its way out of his throat. He had thrown away a sacred miracle for a momentary surge of political ego. He was completely, utterly ruined. Seren slowly pulled back, his lips stained with a single tiny drop of her blood. He gently swiped his thumb across the newly formed, glowing golden mark on her neck, sealing the wound with his own healing magic. He pressed his forehead against hers, taking a long, ragged breath, completely grounding himself in the reality of her survival. When the king finally stood and turned back to face the court, his eyes were entirely black, swimming with the terrifying unleashed power of a fully bonded Lycan monarch. Thomas Sterling, the sovereign pronounced, the absolute weight of his authority slamming down on the kneeling man. You are hereby stripped of your alpha title. You are permanently stripped of your lands, your hunting rights, and your name. You will return to the frozen wasteland you created. You will watch your arrogance turn to ash. If you, or any member of your dying pack, ever look toward this mountain again, I will personally descend upon the valleys and erase your entire bloodline from history. The broken man could not speak. He could not even beg. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of the command crushed his vocal cords. He remained curled on the cold marble floor, his mind entirely shattered by the magnitude of his loss. Seren raised 2 fingers. Immediately, 4 massive, heavily armored royal guards stepped out of the silent ranks. They did not speak. They simply grabbed the former alpha by the thick collar of his freezing animal pelts and dragged him unceremoniously backward down the long aisle of the throne room. His heavy boots scraped pathetically against the polished stone, a hollow, echoing sound of total defeat, until the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, sealing his banishment forever. The immense chamber slowly exhaled. The crushing, violent tension bled away, leaving behind a rich, heavy atmosphere of profound security and quiet triumph. At a subtle gesture from the king, the courtiers, generals, and high-born wolves bowed deeply in perfect, synchronized respect to the woman on the dais, then turned and filed silently out of the grand hall. Within minutes, the massive space was entirely empty, leaving the newly bonded pair completely alone in the golden firelight. The transition from the intense, public retribution of the court to the quiet, domestic sanctuary of their shared space was seamless. The echoes of the past had finally been permanently silenced. Seren turned back to the royal silver throne. The terrifying warlord who had just destroyed a rival alpha with a few softly spoken words melted away, leaving only the devoted, exhausted man. He slowly lowered himself onto the edge of the marble dais. resting his broad back against the heavy legs of her seat. He reached up, his large, calloused hand gently wrapping around her ankle, simply seeking the physical grounding of her presence. Seren looked down at the dark crown of his hair, the brutal cold of the northern blizzard, the humiliating sting of the obsidian altar, and the long freezing years of being unseen felt like a distant, faded nightmare. She slid her hand from the velvet armrest and slowly ran her fingers through his thick hair, feeling the powerful muscles in his massive neck instantly relax under her touch. Fragile creatures were destined to be devoured by the strong. She had lived her entire life believing the terrified, cynical truth, but she had learned that the quietest, most enduring stones could eventually break the sharpest blades. The frozen gates of Silverglade eventually fell to ruin, buried entirely under the suffocating weight of their own arrogance, while the golden hearth fires of Frostpeak Keep burned eternal. The story of the broken Omega who walked away into the snow became a sacred legend passed down through the generations. A permanent reminder that true worth cannot be suppressed, and that even the most terrifying mountain will gladly bow its head to keep the right person warm. No longer a captive, no longer a tool, truly desired. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Did Seren's silent dignity break your heart? Or were you waiting for the moment Thomas finally got what he deserved? Let us know your favorite scene in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts to witness more underdogs claim their crown.